They Tried to Erase Me. Blu Cantrell vs. Beyoncé, Jay-Z, and Diddy's chilling industry power. On a quiet night, in September 2014, the Santa Monica Police Department responded to multiple calls about a barefoot woman running frantically through the streets. Witnesses said she was waving her arms and shouting that someone was releasing poisonous gas into the air. That woman was Blu Cantrell, a Grammy-nominated R&B singer whose voice had once defined a summer, and who over a decade earlier had climbed to the top of the Billboard charts with her hit, Hit 'em Up style, Oops. By sunrise, the tabloids had their headline. TMZ labeled it a meltdown. Commentators called her unstable, washed up, delusional. But what if that night wasn't the beginning of a breakdown, but rather the culmination of something far more calculated? What if instead of a sudden collapse, Blu Cantrell's fall from stardom was the slow result of deliberate silencing from within the very industry that once celebrated her? Her story doesn't begin in a hospital or on a sidewalk. It begins under the lights of a recording studio, on stage at awards shows, and inside high-level meetings at the peak of her career. In the summer of 2001, Blu was on top. Her debut album, So Blue, went gold. Her single Hit 'em Up style hit number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and received 2 Grammy nominations. She was lauded by critics, pursued by 5 major record labels, and invited into rooms most artists only dream of. But success came with shadows. And in Blu's case, those shadows began to stretch as quickly as the spotlight around her grew. According to interviews and first-person accounts scattered across the past decade, she began to notice shifts in how she was treated by peers, producers, and executives. It started subtly calls, not returned sessions, postponed endorsements, withdrawn. At first, she assumed it was industry politics, but over time, a more troubling pattern emerged. During her early rise, Blu was often spotted at industry mixers' studio sessions and exclusive parties alongside Jay-Z. Their connection was never publicly confirmed, but in a 2003 interview with radio host Wendy Williams, Blu deflected pointed questions with a smile and a carefully chosen silence. At the time, Jay-Z was one of music's most powerful rising figures, and by the end of that year, he was publicly aligned with Beyoncé. It was around this same period that Blu began noticing what she later described as creative coincidences. She pointed out that Beyoncé's music video for her Op. 3 Bonnie and Clyde bore striking resemblance to her own Roundup clip released earlier. Then there was Baby Boy Beyoncé's duet with Sean Paul, which dropped shortly after Blu's Breathe, also featuring Sean Paul, had become a hit in the UK. Blu said the similarities weren't just sonic, but visual and lyrical. She noted that Beyoncé's album track signs even mentioned a Sagittarius and a Pisces Jay-Z, and Blu's respective zodiac signs. If Beyoncé has an issue with her man, she told The Guardian she should take it up with him, not me. That quote became a pivot point. What followed, according to Blu, was a near-total freeze-out. Session invitations vanished. Her label's promotional support dried up. And key industry players she once called friends no longer returned messages. Something had changed, but no one said it out loud. As Blu struggled to understand the sudden distance growing between her and the industry, the explanations offered, if any came at all, felt hollow. Internally, some dismissed it as a casualty of shifting trends. Others whispered about her attitude or suggested that maybe she was simply difficult to work with. But Blu believed otherwise. In various interviews over the years, she began to lay out a different theory, that her exclusion was intentional, that it had little to do with her voice or sales and everything to do with who she refused to become. According to Blu, her label Arista Records failed to renew her contract under suspicious circumstances in 2004. She had expected to roll out her second major album with a full promotional budget, studio time, and a marketing team. Instead, she received no notice. Her A&R stopped responding. Tour plans evaporated. And most critically, the lawyer she had trusted to handle her contract negotiations turned out to also be representing Arista, a conflict of interest she says she didn't discover until after the deadline to renew had passed. The fallout was immediate. With no deal in place, she was left with no advance, no marketing muscle, and most painfully, no legal leverage to reclaim her masters. Public records later framed her exit from Arista as voluntary, noting the executive shuffle during the Sony-BMG merger. But Blu's account paints a much darker picture, not corporate confusion, but quiet sabotage. And once she was out, she says there was no way back in. The producers who once lined up to work with her stopped taking calls. Showcase bookings disappeared without explanation. Radio programmers, many of whom had helped catapult her into heavy rotation just 3 years earlier, now wouldn't mention her name on air. Some even began aggressively promoting Beyoncé's singles in her place. It didn't feel like business competition. Blu would later say it felt personal. During this period, she began to speak less publicly, but more pointedly in private. A few trusted journalists caught glimpses of her perspective that the higher echelons of the music world didn't just foster competition, they maintained control. And when an artist deviated from the unspoken rules, the punishment wasn't loud. It was quiet, surgical, career-ending. Then came her recollections of Sean Diddy Combs. Blu referred to him in earlier years as something like a big brother figure in the industry, someone who'd once vouched for her. But as time passed, she began to reflect differently on some of their exchanges. In a 2003 conversation with The Guardian, she expressed concern over nude photos she'd taken as a teenager resurfacing. Diddy's response, she said, was a casual, "Well, I've seen you nude, and you looked cute, babe." At the time, she'd laughed it off. But in hindsight, it marked something else, a reminder of who held the power. Later, Blu would go on to describe a social circuit that operated beneath the public face of the music world, a circuit that included private parties, secret invitations, and favors exchanged in silence. Some invitations, she said, were impossible to turn down without consequences. When she did refuse, she says the fallout was swift and unmistakable. Opportunities disappeared, so did allies. What had looked like a support system became a fortress with the gates closed behind her. Her story, fragmented over years and mostly ignored, at the time now feels eerily prescient. By the time Blu Cantrell began opening up about her experience in fragmented interviews and low-visibility live streams, the industry had largely moved on. New stars had emerged, trends had shifted, and the story of her disappearance had been effectively written. She was a one-hit wonder who couldn't adapt. But behind that convenient narrative, a more disturbing story had been quietly brewing, one that wouldn't fully come into focus until years later, when the same names Blu once hesitated to mention began appearing in federal filings. In late 2024, a civil lawsuit against Sean Diddy Combs took an unexpected and explosive turn. Attorney Tony Busby amended an already high-profile complaint involving coercion and abuse to include another powerful name, Sean J.Z. Carter. The suit alleged that both men were involved in a 2000 incident following the MTV Video Music Awards, an incident involving a minor. Jay-Z's legal team was swift to respond, calling the filing a baseless blackmail attempt and pointing to the absence of criminal charges. But for many, the inclusion of his name in a federal complaint signaled something more than opportunism. It echoed back to the murmurings of artists like Blu, who had long claimed that powerful figures were protected by an unspoken culture of silence. The timing was chilling. Just weeks later, federal prosecutors unsealed a 5-count racketeering indictment against Combs, detailing a long-running operation that allegedly involved sex trafficking, surveillance, and psychological manipulation. The documents described secretive events dubbed freak-offs, where guests were flown across state lines and coerced into sex acts under the influence of drugs and threats. Witnesses spoke of hidden cameras, security guards turned enforcers, and an atmosphere of fear. The phrase freak-off struck a chord online because it was the exact term Blu had used in interviews years earlier, at a time when no one believed her. As court documents piled up, so did the relevance of Blu's past warnings. Social media sleuths began combing through her archived interviews and podcasts, finding quotes that now sounded less like speculation and more like suppressed testimony. She had spoken about being treated as currency, about offers she was expected to accept, and about being punished for choosing autonomy over obedience. Suddenly, her barefoot sprint through Santa Monica didn't seem like a breakdown. It seemed like a last scream from someone who'd spent years watching the world pretend not to see. Still, Blu hadn't released what she referred to as her receipts. In multiple recent live streams, she alluded to an archive she'd kept over the years, signed contracts, voicemail recordings, and flight manifests that, according to her, documented the timeline of her exclusion. She never claimed to have a smoking gun, but insisted that if pushed, she'd push send. That phrase became something of a rallying cry among her supporters online, who began to see her less as a fallen star, and more as a whistleblower who'd simply spoken too early in a world not ready to hear her. Even her detractors, those who questioned her mental state or credibility, began to soften their tone as the lawsuits grew more detailed and corroborated. Because whether or not Blu was involved in the cases now playing out in courtrooms, the conditions she described, the closed-door politics, the transactional parties, the gatekeeping, were no longer fringe claims. They were being submitted as evidence under oath. And while Jay-Z remained only a civil defendant, not a criminal one, his name now sat beside Combs's in official documents. The same timeline, the same social circles, the same power structure. The idea that Blu had been erased by accident seemed harder to defend. While the legal system moved slowly through motions, hearings, and press statements, Blu Cantrell stayed relatively quiet, at least publicly. She refrained from making direct accusations about the ongoing cases, but continued to post cryptic messages that hinted at her long-held knowledge. In one late 2024 Instagram live session, viewed by only a few thousand before being swiftly removed, Blu spoke plainly, "I kept everything. Contracts, voicemails, flight manifests, names, dates, tail numbers. If they push me, I push send." For years, those words would have been dismissed as the rantings of someone unwell until they weren't. After the amended lawsuit against Jay-Z and the formal indictment against Combs, suddenly those claims didn't sound unhinged. They sounded strategic. Some believed she had anticipated this exact moment, a public reckoning, a courtroom spotlight, and a social landscape finally willing to reconsider the stories told by women in entertainment. Her choice to withhold the so-called receipts seemed deliberate. By not releasing anything specific, she avoided legal retaliation from high-powered attorneys who could file swift defamation as countersuits. But by alluding to what she held, she remained part of the conversation, casting a long shadow over an industry still reeling from scandal after scandal. Every blurred contract posted to her IG stories, every audio snippet with no audio, every cryptic hashtag, "Osta Axpasis Sarsis," I still have the tape, was interpreted as a move in a larger strategy. It didn't take long for her name to re-enter headlines, now framed in a dramatically different light. No longer was she just a one-hit wonder with a public meltdown. She was rebranded, at least among many online, as an artist who had tried to speak out years before. Hashtags and class action lawsuits made it safe to do so. The question wasn't whether she was telling the truth, it was whether anyone had been ready to hear it back then. Supporters called on her to testify. Activists within the music industry urged her to join the growing number of voices pushing for transparency and accountability. Yet others warned that releasing raw, unvetted evidence could be dangerous not just for her legal safety, but for her physical safety as well. When the stakes involve billion-dollar brands, global distribution networks, and icons with more influence than most politicians, the price of speaking plainly can be extraordinarily high. What made Blu's story all the more haunting was that she never claimed to be a victim of physical violence or sexual assault. Her narrative was about systemic exile, being iced out for refusing to conform, for not accepting invitations, for pointing out inconsistencies. Her punishment wasn't a crime committed in the dark. It was a slow erasure conducted in broad daylight, visible only to those who looked closely. She described a world where silence was currency, where favors were owed, and where the cost of saying no was your entire career. It was less about what had been done to her, and more about what had been denied opportunity, ownership, protection. Over time, the absence of those things became its own form of violence. And when she finally reacted publicly barefoot and shouting about gas in the streets, the industry didn't ask what broke her. It asked, what's wrong with her? Now, a decade later, that question seems cruelly inverted, because in light of the legal cases and the witness testimony and the federal documents, it's no longer Blu Cantrell's credibility on trial. It's the system that branded her unstable for asking too many questions, and the power players who had the resources to make sure no one believed her. As the courtroom battles intensified and more names surfaced in legal filings, it became increasingly clear that Blu Cantrell's story was not just a footnote in early 2000s music history, it was a case study in what happens when an artist steps outside the boundaries of an unwritten rulebook. The rulebook didn't exist in any contract. It didn't appear in press kits or backstage passes. But everyone who'd lasted in the industry long enough understood it. Some relationships were untouchable, some accusations unspoken, and some voices, especially those of women of color, were easier to discredit than confront. Blu had broken that rule not with lawsuits or explosive exposés, but by being too observant, by refusing to pretend she hadn't noticed creative overlaps, by questioning why her features were quietly dropped from radio, while others thrived with seemingly derivative work, and by calling out what she saw as patterns, even if she didn't have hard proof at the time. It's no coincidence that some of the very elements she once flagged parties that demanded silence, lawyers with dual allegiances contracts that mysteriously lapsed, would later reappear in sworn affidavits and grand jury indictments. For years, her claims were dismissed as the disconnected ramblings of someone paranoid or bitter. But by 2025, they read more like redacted memos made public. Journalists, once quick to mock her, began reaching back out. Podcasts featured lengthy discussions analyzing her past interviews. Viral threads on X, formerly Twitter, laid out detailed timelines, comparing her musical releases with those of more prominent artists she'd once criticized. The parallels were at minimum eerie. At most, they were damning. Still, Blu herself never came out with a tell-all. She didn't appear on major network interviews. She didn't write a memoir. Instead, she maintained a watchful presence, posting just enough to remind the public that she had survived, that she remembered everything, and that the story wasn't over. Whether it was self-preservation, savvy strategy, or both, she had become a rare figure, someone whose silence now spoke louder than any statement. Meanwhile, legal scrutiny around other industry figures continued to mount. The federal racketeering case against Combs expanded to include additional testimony, and more women came forward. Some described being flown to private estates. Others testified to rooms lined with hidden cameras. What had once been chalked up to party culture now stood under the label of coercion, manipulation, and criminal conspiracy. It was a world Blu had hinted at long before the public was willing to accept that such things could happen behind the velvet ropes of fame. She wasn't the first to speak up, but she may have been the first to say just enough without saying too much long before the conversation was deemed legitimate. And then there was Jay-Z. His name remained attached only to civil litigation with no criminal charges filed. His legal team framed the lawsuit as a shameful money grab, insisting that the plaintiff had no evidence and no credibility. Yet his inclusion in the case, even as a peripheral figure, changed the tone of public discourse. This wasn't just about one man, one label, or one accusation. It was about a system with overlapping alliances, sealed doors, and artists caught in the middle with no way out. Blu's story in that context became not only believable, but necessary. A cautionary tale, a warning left in plain sight. As more headlines emerged, a quiet but undeniable shift took place. The very people who once laughed off Blu Cantrell's warnings now reviewed her interviews with new eyes. Clips that had lived in obscurity for years resurfaced across platforms, reframed with captions like, "She was telling the truth all along," and "The industry owes her an apology." Her 2012 interview, where she claimed her attorney had been secretly working for the opposing side, was cited in threads dissecting the legal machinery that allegedly helped silence artists. Even her early comments about her contract vanishing overnight were seen in a harsher light now that similar stories were emerging from other corners of the industry. And yet, despite growing public support, Blu remained cautious. She never named every name. She never dropped the full folder of receipts she claimed to hold. Some believe she's waiting for the legal climate to shift further. Others suggest she's protecting herself from retaliation. But the consensus is that she knows more than she's ever said, and that she's kept meticulous records for exactly this moment. One thing is certain, her leverage has never been stronger. In the past, she was a sidelined voice. Now she's a potential key witness to an era under federal investigation. If she were to release even a portion of what she claims to have, flight manifests showing overlapping names and dates, voicemails from top executives, contracts that contradict public narratives, it could send shockwaves across the upper tiers of entertainment. Not just because of what it would expose, but because of who it would force into the open. Executives, artists, producers, attorneys, some of whom have built billion-dollar empires, could find themselves pulled into a conversation they've spent decades avoiding. Endorsement deals could vanish. Brand partnerships could be severed overnight. Legacy artists could be forced to confront timelines that no longer line up. And the general public, long conditioned to see celebrity scandals as fleeting distractions, might finally understand the scope of what's been kept quiet behind closed studio doors. But Blu also understands the stakes. She's watched other women come forward and face defamation, suits online, harassment, and, in some cases, financial ruin. Speaking up is still not without cost, and in a world where public sympathy often has a short shelf life, she may be waiting to see who truly stands with her beyond the retweets and hashtags. For now, she watches, and the industry watches her. Her story is no longer just a cautionary tale, it's a countdown. A story suspended in motion, one file drop away from igniting the kind of reckoning that publicists, lawyers, and CEOs have spent entire careers trying to prevent. Because if Blu Cantrell presses send, if she uploads even one flight log, one signed contract, one time-stamped voicemail, the fallout won't just be cultural, it'll be structural. It won't only rewrite how we see her past, it could force the music world to re-examine its own. And if that happens, the question won't be, why did Blu break down? It'll be, how did we not listen sooner?